Once I had cops ask me to identify myself to them, they said, "What's your last name?" I said, "I don't have a last name, I have a family name." He said, "Okay, fine, what's your family name?" I said, "Menard." He said, "What's your first name?" I said, "I don't have first names, I have a given names." He said, "Well, what are your given names?" I said, "That depends on who gave them to me. For instance, you folks gave me the names that and fucking." He was like, "You're that fucking Menard." That's 17 divided by 2, that's 8.5. You gotta understand what I know and then see it. I've been speaking a lot of words these last few years, and I know a lot of people are in the courts and facing issues. I'm a shit disturber. I've disturbed some shit, and there's a stink, and I accept to a certain degree the responsibility for raising it. But the thing is, it's not my shit. And it has to be disturbed so that people don't step in it. Now, what we're looking at doing across the country is engaging in a series of what is called a judicial determination, where the practices and the policies of the government and their agents, whether or not it's actual or potential, you can go before the court and ask them to review these actions, compare it to the legislation, and determine whether or not their actions are outside the bounds of the authority granted to them in that legislation. We're going to be asking a series of questions. Basically, all of these questions boil down and will reveal the truth of certain things, certain deceptions that the people in the government certainly do not want revealed. Now, if they try to stop us from engaging in this judicial determination, then clearly they simply don't want the answers. And that means they're very, very, very bad government. Now, these are all very simple questions. The answers have to be secured one way or another. What I would like to see happen is very simply, simple questions answered by the courts, and then the cops are bound by this new reality, this new truth. Some of the key questions, of course, have to do with who really has the authority. Are we children of the state? Are we compelled to obey their orders because we're in possession of government-issued identification? Or is this a common law country, a common law jurisdiction where equality is paramount? Now, these are the fundamental questions that need to be asked and answered so that we know where we stand and we can avoid injustice and bloodshed. Basic, simple questions. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go to court, file documents seeking a judicial review, probably 5 or 6 questions at a time. I'm going to reveal what these questions are so the opposing party knows in part what's coming or what could be coming, and they can, if they wish, try to argue against seeking a judicial determination to have these things answered, which identifies them as very, very bad government, or they can argue on the side of the state boot, which again, to the people in the public, it's going to be identified as bad government. The very first question, seriously, really, are the police above the law, or are they subject to the Criminal Code of Canada? If they're above the law, say so right now. Do so publicly. Let's know about it. But if they're not, then everything else I ask is going to be based upon them being subject to the Criminal Code of Canada, with us stating clearly an intent to use it against them. Everything they get away with rests upon them ignoring the basic fundamental concept of equality. And that's what we need. We need more equality back, and we need these cops to recognize that they too are bound by the Criminal Code of Canada, and that Criminal Code of Canada does in fact empower us to hire each other as peace officers. One of the issues that I don't like with the existing state of affairs is how police officers feel that they have a right and a duty to demand that we identify ourselves to them when they're a peace officer. Now, I've got no problem with that, but What I don't like is I've heard tell of people who, when asked to give a last name, they say, well, I have a family name, and they were charged with obstruction of justice for failure to acknowledge a last name. Human beings don't have last names, they have family names, and what this cop was trying to do was create joinder between his principal and the man using a name that sounds very similar to his own. But if you call it a family name and not a last name, they don't have the claim that they otherwise would have. The problem that I see is that when they say, I want to see identification, I demand you identify yourself, it's very ambiguous. It's pretty much left up to the cops, and they often demand to see government-issued identification. Now, the problem with it is it's government-issued, not merely government-provided, government-sanctioned, government-recognized, but government-issued. If you hold ID issued to you by some party, that party has the power to command and order you about by virtue of that. In the Army, they issue you ID and then they start issuing you orders. And that's what we're facing now. Cops tell you to do something and you say, why? And they say, because I told you to. The only thing that makes sense is the fact that we are holding government-issued identification. They're acting as an agent for the government. And because of that, we are compelled to obey their orders. Now, the question is, what is sufficient for identifying yourself to a peace officer? Is, hi, I'm Rob, sufficient? Or are they going to ask for government-issued identification and insist on government-issued identification? If we have no obligation to request and submit for government-issued identification, we have no obligation to carry it, no obligation to have it, and no obligation to produce it upon demand. And, hi, I'm Rob Menard, should be more than sufficient for me to identify myself to them. If they insist on government-issued identification and then claim the right to assault you and beat you up for failure to not produce it, then we end up with a de facto situation where you are in fact obliged to have government-issued identification just to avoid being beat up by the people hired by that government to enforce its policies. So the fundamental question with that one is, are we obliged to have, hold, and produce upon demand government-issued identification? I say we're not. And I say the argument against it is the fact that the only way to get it is to submit application. And the court, in order to side with the boot, would have to claim that we have a duty to submit and apply. And it means to beg. So let the court make that distinction, or let them put the officers on notice. Now, cops, when they ask you for identification, if they are only willing to accept government-issued identification, and yet we don't have any obligation to have government-issued identification, then the circumstance which is created is that people are getting government-issued identification just to avoid being beat up by the police. And that shouldn't be the case. We should be able to create our own identification, issue it ourselves, and serve them with copies and say, here's my identification, this identifies me, and yet no party issued it, and so no party would have a legal claim of authority over you. However, they don't like that. They insist on government-issued identification. You don't have that, they bring you to jail. This is the Canada we're living in because the people who are making the words, who are creating the statutes, these people know that we have no obligation to have government-issued identification. We have no obligation to hold it, no obligation to produce it upon demand. But they craft words that are ambiguous enough that they would cause these police officers who are heady in their desire to protect us from our own rights. These people can interpret it in a manner that allows them to think that we have a duty to have government-issued identification and produce it upon demand. This has got to stop. If you look at what some of the requirements are for flying in Canada, we have a right to travel. But if you try flying in Canada nowadays without government-issued identification, not merely government-recognized or provided, actual government-issued, then you're not allowed on the plane. And what's very sneaky about it, by applying for government-issued identification, you abandon your right to fly in exchange for a privilege to fly, requiring government permission. And when they put you on the list, the no-fly list, what they are doing is saying, we have revoked this person's permission to fly, which means you're not exercising a right at all. But if you don't have government-issued identification, there is simply no way for them to legally claim that they have revoked your permission because you weren't relying on their permission. It all boils down to holding identification issued by a party and the amount of authority that grants the issuing party over you because you decided to submit and apply.
Freedom, freedom's for free.
Now, these people are hired as not so much as peace officers, but as policy enforcement officers, revenue generators, money collectors. They're limited by the peace officer status. In a common law jurisdiction, people have the right to refuse intercourse with a peace officer who has not observed them breach the peace. And that means you are not obliged to identify yourself to a peace officer upon demand unless they have observed a breach of the peace. So the question is this: are we obliged to engage in intercourse with a peace officer who has not observed us breach the peace? I say we're not. I say we're free human beings, and as long as we're acting peaceably, those peace officers should go find something better to do. Now, this is a big one, and I'm sure the courts aren't going to like it, but it's key to the entire situation because these courts are using these officers of the courts, these RCMP officers, and they are generating revenue. It's like, who let the dogs out, and why the hell aren't they on their leash? And if they're not on the leash, put a muzzle on them. Do these courts require the consent of both parties to the adjudication or not? It's a very simple question. I know the answer to it. And the answer to it, you better not abandon equality and its paramount importance in a common law jurisdiction. So answer that question. Do your courts, those courts that you're operating, providing adjudication services, do you require the consent of both parties to the adjudication? Or do you claim the right to govern your fellow man in a common law jurisdiction without their consent? Now, if you read the Criminal Code of Canada, you'll find a section in there very interesting. It deals with de facto and de jure. And essentially what it states is that it's no longer a crime to obey the orders of a de facto government. Now, in the absence of this section, obeying those orders would in fact be a crime. You could be charged for it, and refusing to obey those orders would clearly not be a crime. Now, what they have done is they've stated quite clearly that it's no longer a crime to obey. Has it changed the other part of the equation, however? Does it state clearly, specifically, and unequivocally that disobeying the orders of a de facto government is unlawful? You know they're all de facto, right? I've seen a lot of people argue against the free man perspective, and they try to argue, well, you're in Canada, obey the Canadian laws. But what they fail to do is distinguish between the actual law, which says you won't harm, damage, or use fraud in your contracts, and a bunch of statutes and acts which are really only applicable against those people who secure benefits from the government by way of the fact that they have a social insurance number or they hold government-issued identification. Now, many people say because you're in Canada, you're bound by Canadian society. But the thing is, we have a right of association. And that means I have a right to stay in Canada and not be associated with any society whatsoever. In my position, a society is a number of people joined by mutual consent to deliberate, determine, and act for a common goal. The question is, am I a member of a society merely by virtue of my physical presence in a geographical location? Or is consent required to be a member of a society? Now, if consent is required to be a member of a society, can we be ordered to leave the place of our birth because we don't consent to the corporations ordering us to be their employees and then governing us like that? The next one down, the corollary, would be, can a society be deemed to exist if it doesn't have a legal name? My position is that I am not a member of a society, and therefore I am not subject to the statutes of that society. And the people who make these statutes, if I'm not a member of their society, they have no right in a common law jurisdiction hiring armed agents to enforce their policies upon me. Now, also in the Criminal Code of Canada, which I intend to use to put the cops back in their place, it states that a peace officer is anyone hired to preserve and maintain the public peace. So the question is, the ability to hire peace officers, is that limited or restricted to corporations providing municipal services, or can the people of the country hire each other directly to operate and act as peace officers in order to control and police the existing police? I say we do have a right. There's no limit to the definition, essentially, and anyone hired or employed to preserve and maintain the public peace, they have the right to claim that they are peace officers. And when we start dealing with these policy enforcement officers who have abandoned their own peace officer status, we will be in a position to deal with them lawfully, with us as peace officers and them as the criminals. Now let's have a little look at what happens if we're peace officers. First of all, the police right now, they claim that they have the right when conducting an investigation to lie. They can say whatever they want. They can threaten you with an arrest for failure to produce government-issued identification, even though you don't have it, you have no obligation to have it. And in my mind, that is a perversion of justice on their part. They can do all sorts of things that people who aren't peace officers can't do. So if we all become peace officers, then when they come and as policy enforcement officers, they try engaging in intercourse with us or demanding that we do certain things, we can actually be conducting an investigation. Essentially what's going to happen is the people of Canada will become their professional standards division, because their professional standards division are not doing the job. People are getting tasered when they're in handcuffs for failure to comply. They're being tortured to achieve their compliance, and the people doing this get paid vacations. People are dying out there at the hands of these cops who have no idea that there are in fact limits to their authority. And it's about time the people of this country outline very clearly, specifically, and unequivocally exactly where their authority stops and ours begins. Now, a fundamental right that exists is our right to travel on this planet. And the police officers, because they're generating revenue out of it, they claim that the Highway Traffic Acts and the Motor Vehicle Acts across the country and the various provinces have removed our right to do so. So the question is, which section of the Highway Traffic Act or Motor Vehicle Act clearly, specifically, and unequivocally removed previously existing rights? You can't point to a section and say this says every person must, and anything like that. It must mention the right itself in order for you to claim that that right has been removed. An act that doesn't mention a right cannot be deemed to remove that right, because otherwise an act that mentions no rights could be deemed to remove all rights. If you want to claim a body of words has removed a previously existing right, it better do so clearly, specifically, and unequivocally. And you can't do that. So we're going to be asking the courts to identify that section. And if they can't, they must recognize the unmentioned right still exists. Now the other question is, they try to claim that you're breaching the peace because you don't make their job easy. But is exercising a right peaceably, such as traveling down the highway in your own privately owned automobile as a member of the public using the public roads, is that a breach of the peace or not? Is refusing to engage in intercourse with a peace officer who has not observed you breach the peace, is that a breach of the peace? Now, a fundamental thing that I see happening is a whole lot of unlawful arrests and assaults being committed by the police officers. What I want to know is whether or not an unlawful arrest is in fact an unlawful assault. And do we have the right to defend ourselves against unlawful assaults? It all boils down in the end to us and our property and our freedom and what rights we have to preserve, protect, promote, and exercise those. In the criminal code, it speaks about holding property under a claim of right and how, when we do so, we have the right to use whatever level of force and violence is necessary to preserve that possession and to protect our property from being removed from us. Now let's suppose we're traveling down the highway and some cop who's acting as an agent for a corporation tries claiming that because you're not in contract with his principal that you can't travel. And he wants to confiscate or commandeer your vehicle. If you're holding it under a claim of right, what power do we have to hold on to that and to refuse their directives to step out of the car so they can tow it away? It's going to end up tying back in with our peace officers and whether or not we have a right to call them up to come and deal with these highwaymen. The other thing that needs to be addressed, are we obliged to register our children? And if we are not obliged, can the government provide services to our children if they're not registered? Specifically, can they remove someone? Can they seize custody of a child who has never been registered? Now, from what I see, they claim that they're providing services to the child. However, they also claim that they cannot provide services to an unregistered child, and they have no legal name to operate upon if the child is not registered. Now, bear in mind, registering a child, if you read the documentation, especially in Ontario, it states that you're doing two things by submitting those documents. You are recording and registering. You're recording the event and you're registering or signing over the child to the government. They let you keep the child and take care of it, but they can come in at any time past that and remove that child if they don't like how the child is being treated or the political views of the parents. So the question is, are the free people of Canada obliged to register our offspring, or is that a choice? Is the act of registering our offspring, does that generate a legal entity? Does it give people power over our kids which they otherwise would not have? Now here's the other issue that needs to be raised and settled and judicially determined. What often happens is the police will get a warrant for the arrest of someone. Now, a warrant is a commercial instrument, very much like a check, and without an endorsement, it has no value, it's void. What they'll do is they will get an unendorsed warrant, they go and arrest someone on that unendorsed warrant, and then they say, well, we're going to hold you before we bring you to a judge, or you can endorse it yourself and sign this promise to appear. Now, when you go to court after that, they've got evidence that that warrant was endorsed by you. But here's the thing, it wasn't endorsed to begin with, it's void, and the cops shouldn't even be trying to exercise or enforce it. Here's another little trick what I caught them doing. They will get a warrant and the judge won't endorse it because he hasn't secured a proper appearance yet, and he doesn't have the consent of both parties to the adjudication. So what they do is they'll create a warrant and not sign it. They make a photocopy of that warrant and then they endorse that and they put that in the pipeline, so the police think they're dealing with a copy of an endorsed warrant when all they're dealing with is an endorsed copy of an unendorsed warrant. This is the type of perversion of justice that is happening regularly in the courts across Canada because we've allowed them to be hijacked by private entities who are operating them for their own personal profit. Now, some people, they talk about freemen and they call us freeloaders, and they try to claim that because we question the way things are operating, we don't like the system at all. Because we don't accept the way the corporations are operating our communities, we hate communities. And you know what I liken it to? I liken it to a ship. Now imagine a passenger liner, and this is Canada, our nation, and it's our ship. And now suddenly I see the food's getting horrible. People are speaking to us over the PA and they're commanding us in a foreign language and telling us we have to do what they say because they said so. There's mud on their boots. No one has seen the captain in ages. And folks, the coastline is on the wrong side of the ship. Our ship has been hijacked by corporations. They want our resources, and you're part and parcel of the cargo. Let me tell you this, I am not your cargo. I am not your cargo, I am not your parcel, and this ship, it belongs to the people of Canada, not to the corporations who, using deception, have successfully hijacked our ship. We're not your cargo. And when you argue about the state of affairs and you seek remedy, lawful, peaceful, just remedy against the state of affairs, their argument is, oh, you hate the ship. You think you can exist without the ship. Nobody wants to exist all on their own, out in the forest, by themselves, defending themselves against everyone like they're an enemy. But this is our country, and I am not giving it up without a fight. People have to wake up. They have to stop being asleep and thinking that everything's hunky-dory because they're not in the water. Everything's not hunky-dory. You know what? I'm sorry if I'm getting a little bit aggressive here, but this is my country and it seems like it's under assault by a bunch of hijackers who have stolen my country. Woosah. Woosah. Now the thing is, if the government wasn't trying to use their identification services as a means of securing unlawfully and deceptively powers over us, they could simply provide that identification by way of a demand. But instead they claim that you have to submit an application and then they'll give it to you. You're abandoning all your rights as a citizen or as a human being essentially, and you're begging. Now the ramifications of this action means that they then are in a position where the rights and the freedoms that your grandfathers had are no longer yours, and you are essentially a government employee, a government agent bound to obey their orders. And you are clearly one of their resources. There are people who try to denigrate the free man movement and identify us with a violent faction and try to claim that we're domestic homegrown terrorists because we insist on standing for our rights. And they try to claim that because we're doing so, we're extremists because we're questioning the limits of the state authority and the power of the state boot. But if you look at the world, you're going to see a growing level of personal consciousness. And this is being expressed now by the courageous people of Egypt. I believe Canada has a role to play to demonstrate to the world that there is a peaceful method available to us to control these people who try to claim that our resources belong to them, and oh, incidentally, you're our resource too. What I'm trying to do here might seem to some police officers out there, and I know there's a lot of police officers going to be watching this, and I know a lot of you are very good, decent human beings, and you are true peace officers, and you shouldn't be worried about this action at all, because all we're doing is seeking some clarity from the courts. What I'm trying to do is not empower the people to bring violence to bear against the police. I am trying to give the people the tools necessary to fix this problem without violence. And I don't think anyone should have a problem with that. Peter, you can't trust any pepper picker, especially if he's picking pickled peppers. They've already been picked. They've been plucked from the vine and soaked in brine for a long, long time. What the hell is Peter doing? Re-picking, pre-picked, pre-packaged pickled peppers.